But the Washington establishment, they respond with ridicule, they respond with attacks, they respond by trying to zero out your money. That's part of the tools of the establishment. No. If you're going to stand up and rock the boat, you know what? None of the lobbyists are going to write you checks. But let me tell you what Mike understands. He doesn't work for the lobbyists in Washington. He works for the people of the great state of Utah. And Mike wakes up every day accountable to you, remembering that he's got to come back, he's got to look you in the eyes, and he's got to be able to say, I've honored the promises I've made to you. I've fought for the Constitution, I've fought for your freedom, and I haven't sold out to Washington, but instead we are holding Washington accountable. Mike Lee is the conscience of the United States Senate, a body not used to having a conscience. And that is incredibly valuable. I'll tell you, just as a final aside, Mike is also just a heck of a lot of fun. Look, Mike and Sharon, their kids have become incredible dear friends. Mike, every week in his Senate office in Washington, gives away free Jell-O. If he were representing Kentucky, it might be bourbon. But as the senator from Utah, it is Jell-O every week. Although occasionally he goes out on the wild side, puts some fruit in the Jell-O. Mike, you may not know it, but the man is a trivia beast for 70s rock lyrics at a really frightening level. I don't know for sure, but I'm willing to bet that he knows every word to Anagata Davida, which I don't think anybody knows every word to Anagata Davida. But I'll tell you, Mike and I also text each other constant. Whether sitting next to each other at the Senate Judiciary hearings, we're texting back and forth. At the lunches, when someone says something, and usually our texts are you kidding me? But I'm going to actually out Mike. My favorite texts. There is an app on the iPhone called Dubsmash, where you can take different lyrics and you can record your own video. And some months ago, my favorite text I got from him was the scene at the end of Braveheart, when Mel Gibson is being tortured and executed. And when he screams out, freedom. Mike texted me that audio with the video of Mike simply yelling, freedom! And if that is not inspiration to battle, I don't know what is. So I'm proud to give you a man that I love like a brother, a principled warrior and champion for the Constitution, the conscience of the United States Senate, and your senator, Senator Mike Lee.
First of all, thanks to all of you for being here. You're all my friends, and I'm so glad you're with me this morning. I always enjoy opportunities to introduce one group of my friends to another group of friends. Two groups of friends that haven't previously met each other. And today, it's been so wonderful to share my friends Ted and Glenn and Carly with you. And Carly, Glenn, and Ted, thank you for being here. Thank you for being my friends. Thank you for standing with me. You know, it is often said that when you go to Washington, you try to stand by something, you try to stand by the principles by which you were elected, that you make a lot of enemies. And that's true. Along the way, you also pick up a few friends, and that's why I'm so grateful. I'm glad to have my wife Sharon and our children James, John, and Eliza with us. We've been talking about what an amazing thing it is in Utah right now. You know, as we have this presidential contest coming up on Tuesday here in Utah, we've had some really important dignitaries. We've, of course, had Ted Cruz, and we're so glad about that. But we've had a few others. You know, John Kasich was here. And John Kasich has been town halling. Then we've got Donald Trump. Yeah. And he's been bawling and brawling. Bernie Sanders. And he's a socialist, and that's just appalling. You know, you might say that this is the most presidential candidates that we've ever had in Utah at one time since the Romneys and the Huntsmans had their joint family picnic a couple years ago. I think back a lot lately as we're kicking off this campaign for 2016 about my 2010 campaign. In some ways, it seems like just a few weeks ago. In other ways, it seems like about 40 years ago. I think about how it felt and how it still feels, how it's felt the entire time. I've felt a little bit like we who share these values are a little bit like David. And sometimes we're having to stand up for Goliath. As we stand up to Goliath, we remember the fact that when you first read that story, you realize that the smart money at the time would never have been on David. It always would have been on Goliath. I mean, the guy was huge. Huge. Even more huge than Donald Trump's hair. Almost as huge as my friend Fred Roberts, who's here somewhere. He's really huge. He was a really big guy, and he was armed to the gills. David was small. He wasn't armed except with a couple of small stones and a sling. But we know how that story ended, don't we? David was the victor. In fact, David won in part not just in spite of his small stature, but in part because of it. He understood something that Goliath didn't. They came from very different backgrounds. You see, the god, or we would say the gods of Goliath, weren't focused on the same things that the God of David was focused on. Those who worshipped the Phoenician gods, worshipped by Goliath and his people, had their focus on the immediate. You worshiped them and you hoped for immediate rain. Not so with the God of David, who was more concerned about the welfare of the soul. And in part because of that, in part because David understood that his true strength came from principle. David understood that his strength came from God. He won. When we started our campaign 6 years ago, people said what we were trying to do was impossible. And after a while, they stopped saying that, then they just said, well, it's improbable. What emerged in 2010 was a force, a team, that when united became absolutely unstoppable. We stood together, we stood on principle, and we won. We as a people face a daunting task similarly. We as a people, the American people, now face a distant national government that taxes us too much, that regulates us too heavily, and is so far from the people and from their hearts and minds that it's often slow and utterly unwilling to respond to our needs. But we're still going to win.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous fight o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rockets' red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave?
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mary Ann Mendoza.
Good morning. I'm Mary Ann Mendoza. My son, Sergeant Brandon Mendoza, was on his way home from work when an illegal criminal who was 3 times a legal limit drunk, high on meth, and who drove for over 35 miles the wrong way on 4 different Phoenix freeways on May 12, 2014, slammed into my son's car head-on, killing him. Brandon was on his way home from his 10-hour shift, protecting the citizens in Mesa as he had done for 13 years. His killer had been arrested in Colorado in 1994. At no surprise to anyone, because there is no accountability, he never showed up to court. He was roaming this country back and forth into Mexico until 2002 when he was apprehended at the border. They took him back to Colorado, and the court showed him leniency for his crimes, which included assaulting a police officer, and released him back onto the streets of this country so that he could go on later on a drunken, drug-fueled drive and kill my son. My son gave a lot to his community. He not only worked his job, but he was a beat cop. He took time to get to know everybody in his beat. He went door to door. He was invited into their homes for dinner. He looked after the elderly living in the area, notifying relatives if there was problems.